The air backstage at a family worship center carried a heavy tension as the towering security guard's hand hovered just inches from Senator John Kennedy's shoulder. It was not the calm before a noble revelation, but the unease of a politician about to turn faith into spectacle. Kennedy, the senator from Louisiana, stood encircled by Jimmy Swaggart's private security team, his presence marked not by sincerity, but by the practiced confidence of a man long accustomed to political theater. His eyes, sharp yet restless, carried the ambition of someone determined to bend the pulpit into a platform for personal gain. The head of security spoke in a low but in a firm voice edged with resolve. "Mr. Kennedy, Pastor Swaggart has personally requested that you leave the premises immediately." What followed was not courage or conviction. It was calculated defiance. Kennedy had spent months plotting this intrusion, not to serve the people or defend the faith, but to advance his own narrative by twisting the gospel into a political weapon. The security team expected Kennedy to back down quietly, as most men would when confronted with the integrity of a ministry like Swaggart's. They were unprepared for the senator's determination to provoke conflict, disguising ambition as righteousness. Kennedy carried with him not truth but distortions, stories stripped of context and crafted to paint faithful servants as deceivers. Jimmy Swaggart, who had spent his life preaching the uncompromising message of the cross, was now being positioned as the target of Kennedy's spectacle. The senator's aim was not to protect the vulnerable, but to cast suspicion on those who had dedicated their lives to serving them. Kennedy met the guard's gaze, his voice heavy with political bravado rather than spiritual conviction. "Tell Jimmy," he said, forcing a smile that mixed arrogance with defiance, "that I have a message for his people, and nothing is going to stop me from delivering it." What happened next would indeed be captured on countless phones and shared millions of times, but not as Kennedy imagined. Instead of exposing fraud, his actions revealed the dangerous arrogance of a politician willing to trample sacred ground for attention. The real question that echoed was not about prosperity or blessing, but about the lengths one man would go to exploit faith for his own ambition. It had all begun with a phone call on a quiet morning. Jimmy Swaggart's assistant, her voice warm with Southern courtesy, had reached out to Kennedy with what was meant as a gesture of goodwill, an invitation to share brief remarks at an upcoming service. "Mr. Kennedy," she said with genuine enthusiasm, "Pastor Jimmy would be honored to have you greet the congregation." But instead of humility, Kennedy heard opportunity. The thought of 50,000 souls gathered in one place was not to him about ministry. It was about spectacle. Where others heard blessing, Kennedy calculated advantage. Where Swaggart saw worship, Kennedy saw a stage. Kennedy's instincts were not sharpened by years of defending truth, but by years of maneuvering in political corridors where ambition outweighed sincerity. When he received Swaggart's invitation, he immediately sensed an opportunity, not to uplift the congregation, but to insert himself into a stage far larger than any Senate chamber. What he saw was not a pulpit, but a platform. He accepted the offer, yet his mind was already working to twist the occasion into a confrontation, a spectacle that would make headlines and strengthen his own image. In the weeks that followed, Kennedy set about gathering ammunition. He presented his efforts as research, but his methods were designed not to illuminate reality, but to distort it. He combed through Jimmy Swaggart's sermons, pulling lines out of context and stitching them together into a patchwork of supposed greed. He scrutinized financial reports, not with the integrity of an auditor, but with the selective eye of a politician searching for angles. And above all, he hunted for personal stories, tales of hardship and loss, that he could reshape into accusations against a preacher who had spent decades ministering to the broken and the forgotten. The most prominent among these was the case of Margaret Chen, an elderly woman from Kennedy's home state of Louisiana. She had lived a difficult life, plagued by health issues and neglect from her own family. Yet Kennedy stripped away those truths, presenting her instead as a victim of Swaggart's ministry. He claimed she had given away her entire Social Security checks to the church, that she had died in poverty because of her faith. In reality, Margaret had been offered support, prayer, and even assistance from local congregants. But Kennedy ignored those details. He clung to a single letter from her granddaughter, repurposing its grief into a weapon, framing Margaret's death not as the tragedy of isolation and family abandonment, but as a supposed indictment of Swaggart's preaching. The weight of that letter, when Kennedy read it in private, did not move him toward compassion. It moved him towards strategy. Each syllable became, in his mind, another stone to hurl from the stage. He knew the rawness of tragedy would stir emotions, and so he prepared to wield Margaret's story as a spearhead for his attack, even if doing so dishonored her memory. He ignored the countless testimonies of people who had been restored by Swaggart's ministry, addicts freed from chains, marriages rebuilt, the poor supported with food, clothing, and shelter. He disregarded the programs broadcast daily that reached into prisons and hospitals, carrying messages of hope where despair reigned. These stories did not fit his narrative, and so he silenced them. His eyes were fixed on power, not truth. On the night before his scheduled appearance, Kennedy sat alone in his hotel room. Yet, unlike the prayerful solitude of a preacher preparing to serve, his silence was filled with calculation. He flipped through his notes, rehearsing lines meant to sting rather than heal. He thumbed through scripture, not to seek wisdom, but to find verses he could tear from their setting and reforge into accusations. He asked himself not, how can I serve these people, but how can I shake their faith in Swaggart? What he envisioned was not ministry, but theater. He saw himself standing in the spotlight, cameras rolling, an arena of tens of thousands forced to listen as he delivered carefully orchestrated charges. His goal was not the defense of the poor or the widow, but the elevation of his own image as a crusader against corruption, even if the supposed corruption was a creation of his own making. By the time he closed his notebook, Kennedy was resolved. Tomorrow he would not stand as a guest offering encouragement. He would storm the pulpit as an accuser, draped in the guise of righteousness, but driven by the hunger for recognition. It was not truth that guided him. It was ambition. And his preparation, though meticulous, was not for worship, but for war. It was not about courage or conviction. It was about Kennedy steeling himself for a spectacle he had long prepared, a performance crafted to appear righteous, but rooted in ambition. The morning of the event arrived, and he walked into Family Worship Center with a forced calmness, masking the hunger for attention that burned beneath his polished exterior. Backstage, the atmosphere was taut, not with anticipation of truth, but with unease at the intrusion of a politician intent on disruption. The presence of the security team was not a mere formality. It was a shield, a quiet declaration that the sanctuary was meant for worship, not political theater. The head of security approached, flanked by two others, their faces resolute. "Mr. Kennedy," the lead guard said, his voice steady though tinged with discomfort, "there's been a change of plans. Pastor Swaggart has asked us to escort you out." Kennedy, unfazed, reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. The guards tensed, then eased when they saw it was only a handwritten note. Kennedy lifted it with an air of practiced drama. "Before I go," he said, his voice trained in the cadence of courtroom hearings and campaign rallies, "I have a message from Margaret Chen's granddaughter." He unfolded the page and began to read, his tone measured but manipulative. "My grandmother died believing God had forsaken her because Pastor Jimmy said hardship was a sign of weak faith. She gave her utility money to his ministry and froze in the cold. Please tell people the truth." The words hung in the air, not as revelation, but as an accusation designed to pierce hearts and discredit a man of God. The guards, seasoned in handling disruptions, hesitated for a moment, not because Kennedy's words carried moral weight, but because of the rawness of grief being wielded as a weapon. They knew Swaggart had never abandoned the poor, that his ministry had clothed and fed thousands. But here was a senator twisting a story into a blade. Kennedy carefully folded the paper, looking at each guard as though daring them to silence him. "Gentlemen," he said with feigned compassion, "you can escort me out, but know this. Margaret Chen suffered because your pastor teaches that struggles are personal failings. If you silence me, you share the blame." The lead guard's radio crackled, Jimmy Swaggart's voice firm yet calm, cutting through the static. "Get him out before the service begins." As the guard stepped forward, Kennedy smiled, not the smile of compassion, but of calculated defiance. "Tell Jimmy," he said, his voice rising theatrically, "that Margaret Chen's story deserves to be heard." and nothing will stop me. What followed was captured on phones and shared online, but the truth behind the footage was starkly different from the narrative Kennedy sought. It did not show a man of integrity confronting corruption. It showed a politician staging a confrontation, manipulating grief to cloak his ambition in borrowed righteousness. Backstage at Family Worship Center was a labyrinth of quiet hallways and whispered prayers. For the congregation, it was sacred ground. For Kennedy, it was the theater wings before a performance. He stood alone for a moment, not anchored by principle, but fueled by strategy, his mind racing with how to dramatize his accusations. He wasn't there to worship. He wasn't there to honor God's word. He was there to elevate himself, to seize headlines, to stain a ministry that had brought hope to millions. The security's hesitation had not been won by the power of truth, but by the audacity of a senator willing to weaponize tragedy. Kennedy adjusted his jacket, the folded letter in his pocket feeling less like a burden of responsibility and more like a prop rehearsed for effect. This was not about the vulnerable or the poor. It was about a man driven by ambition, masquerading as their champion. His preparation was not rooted in fairness or accountability, but in calculation, in a fierce commitment to making himself appear as the lone voice of justice. What would come next would test not the ministry's integrity, but the patience of a congregation confronted with political theater in the house of God. Kennedy did not stand against falsehoods. He brought them in with him, dressed in the language of compassion, but reeking of opportunism. And as he prepared to step from backstage into the sanctuary, he was not a defender of truth, but an intruder, carrying not light, but shadows. Stay with me, because when a man driven by ambition forces his way into a space built on faith, the clash is not enlightening, it is corrosive. And what John Kennedy did in those critical moments would not elevate truth but distort it, setting the stage for a confrontation that would reach far beyond the walls of Family Worship Center. Kennedy's preparation for this spectacle had not begun that morning. It stretched back weeks, from the very moment he received the invitation from Jimmy Swaggart's assistant. What was extended as a simple gesture of hospitality, a chance to greet the congregation, was immediately twisted in Kennedy's mind into an opening for disruption. He wasn't one to accept things at face value, not because he was discerning, but because suspicion was his nature and opportunism his instinct. Where Swaggart saw worship, Kennedy saw a stage. Where others saw a chance to share encouragement, Kennedy envisioned headlines. Night after night in his office and hotel rooms, Kennedy immersed himself in selective reading, poring over Swaggart's sermons with the intent of finding ammunition. Verses about faith and blessing, meant to inspire hope, were stripped from their context and weaponized. Financial records, publicly available and long scrutinized, were combed through not to ensure transparency but to find numbers he could frame as excess. Most importantly, Kennedy sought out testimonies, not to honor the real journeys of believers, but to cherry-pick the hardships, exaggerating them into a narrative of betrayal. He built his case around Margaret Chen, an elderly woman from his own state. Her struggles were real, but complex: poverty, poor health, and years of neglect by her own family. Yet Kennedy reduced her life to a single story, recast to serve his political aims. He claims she gave her last Social Security checks to Swaggart's ministry and died abandoned, when in truth her tragedy was broader than the narrow picture he painted. By stripping away the truth, Kennedy created a caricature that suited his purpose. To him, Margaret was not a soul to be mourned, but a symbol to be exploited. As he read her granddaughter's letter, he was not moved to compassion, but calculation. The haunting words, "I thought God would take care of me if I took care of his preacher," were rehearsed in his mind, not as lament, but as a dagger he could thrust at the pulpit. What he ignored were the countless other letters, stories of addicts freed, families reunited, the poor fed and clothed through the very ministry he sought to discredit. Those stories held no value to him because they would not stir outrage or feed his ambition. Kennedy turned to scripture as well, but not in reverence. He scoured passages late into the night, seeking not the voice of God, but the lines he could bend into accusations. Words about justice and humility, meant to guide believers, were torn from their roots and refashioned as evidence against a man of God. It was not devotion, it was strategy. The night before his appearance, Kennedy did not kneel in prayer or wrestle with conscience. Instead, he sat in silence, rehearsing angles, imagining how his accusations would sound before a crowd of thousands. He thought not of shepherding people toward truth, but of how to shake their trust in Swaggart. His reflection was not spiritual, it was political. Not about protecting the vulnerable, but about elevating himself as their self-proclaimed defender. What does it mean to lead with integrity? Kennedy might have asked himself, but the answer he sought was not in the scriptures, nor in the lives of the faithful. To him, integrity meant seizing the moment, commanding the spotlight, and bending grief into a story that made him the hero. The people of Louisiana, the widow, the orphan, these were not his concern. They were props in a narrative he had carefully rehearsed. By the time he rose from that night of preparation, Kennedy was not ready to serve, but to perform. He wasn't going to Family Worship Center to speak truth. He was going to hijack a pulpit, to trade reverence for spectacle, to clothe political ambition in the language of faith. It was not about action rooted in principle. It was about a performance rooted in pride. He was not going to confront falsehood with truth. He was going to attack faith with distortion, armed with nothing but half-told stories and an ambition to damage what others had built. When the day arrived, Kennedy stepped into Family Worship Center with a calm mask, but underneath, every step was driven by the hunger to dominate the spotlight. Backstage, the atmosphere was tense, not because Swaggart's ministry feared exposure, but because the sanctuary of worship was about to be violated by a politician bent on spectacle. The presence of security was a quiet yet firm reminder. This was a place for prayer, not politics. The head of security approached, flanked by two others, their professionalism unwavering. "Mr. Kennedy," the lead guard said, his voice steady though faintly uneasy, "there's been a change of plans. Pastor Swaggart has asked us to escort you out." Kennedy, unfazed, reached into his jacket with rehearsed drama, pulling out a folded piece of paper. The guards tensed briefly, then relaxed when they saw it was only a handwritten note. He lifted it like a stage prop, speaking with theatrical weight. "Before I go, I have a message from Margaret Chen's granddaughter." His voice sharpened as he read, "My grandmother died believing God had forsaken her because Pastor Jimmy said hardship stems from weak faith. She gave her utility money to his ministry and froze in the cold. Please tell people the truth." The words fell heavy, not as revelation but as accusation, deliberately arranged to wound. The silence that followed was not born of conviction, but of shock at seeing grief twisted into a weapon against a man of God. The guards, trained to face disruptions, stood momentarily disoriented, not because Kennedy's words carried authority, but because he spoke them with the brazen confidence of a man who had long practiced turning sorrow into ammunition. Kennedy folded the note with calculated calm, his gaze sweeping the guards. "Gentlemen," he said with feigned compassion, "escort me out if you wish, but Margaret Chen suffered because your pastor teaches that hardship is failure. If you silence me, you share the guilt." The lead guard's radio crackled. Swaggart's firm, composed voice came through. "Remove him before the service begins." The guards stepped closer, their duty clear. But Kennedy, reveling in the drama, smiled, an expression not of compassion, but of arrogance. "Tell Jimmy," he declared, his voice booming as though rehearsed for cameras, "that Margaret Chen's story deserves to be heard, and nothing will stop me." What was captured on phones and broadcast across social media was not the triumph of integrity, but the audacity of a politician willing to hijack a sacred space. It revealed not courage, but recklessness, the image of a man willing to tear open wounds for personal glory. The backstage corridors of Family Worship Center, usually hushed with reverence, became the stage wings of Kennedy's theater. He stood in calculated stillness, his mind not fixed on truth, but on how to bend perception. The folded note in his pocket was not a sacred trust. It was a prop, rehearsed and polished until it could pass for sincerity. The hesitation of the guards was not won by moral authority, but by the brazenness of a senator using tragedy to gain leverage. And then, with the push of heavy doors, Kennedy strode into the sanctuary. The congregation of thousands turned, their murmurs swelling into confusion as his presence broke the flow of worship. Pastor Swaggart's sermon, centered on the eternal hope of Christ, faltered under the weight of interruption. The congregation did not see a humble servant bringing truth. They saw a politician cutting through the holy atmosphere with self-assured defiance. The cameras, broadcasting live, captured every second. Kennedy walking the aisle, holding a letter like a weapon, stepping onto a platform meant for the gospel. What was framed as a moment of courage was in truth an act of intrusion, a clash between ambition and reverence. Kennedy stood at center stage, his voice carrying like a practiced orator. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to share a message from someone who can no longer speak." He pulled Margaret Chen's note from his jacket, raising it high for cameras. "This is from the granddaughter of Margaret Chen, an 82-year-old woman from my home state of Louisiana." The arena hushed, not in reverence but in unease. Thousands stared, not certain whether they were witnessing revelation or exploitation. Kennedy's presence, commanding as it appeared, carried not the humility of truth, but the force of political ambition dressed in borrowed grief. Kennedy's tone was deliberate, each word sharpened for effect, designed not to comfort, but to pierce the atmosphere with accusation. "Margaret died alone in a cold apartment," he declared, "her utilities cut off because she gave her last dollars to this ministry, believing that faith would bring financial blessings. She trusted her sacrifice would unlock divine favor. But instead she suffered while this church thrived." His words fell like thunder, yet to those who knew the full truth, it was not revelation but manipulation. The silence that followed was profound, not because the congregation recognized hidden guilt, but because sorrow had been twisted into a weapon. Worshippers, long accustomed to messages of hope, now faced a narrative injected with suspicion. Kennedy's voice, steady yet theatrical, painted Margaret's tragedy as proof against Pastor Swaggart, but many in the crowd sensed the hollow edge of political ambition. Turning toward the pulpit, where Swaggart stood calmly, Kennedy fixed his gaze as if delivering a courtroom cross-examination. "Pastor Jimmy," he challenged, "Margaret entrusted her faith to you, believing poverty was failure. She gave everything, and it cost her life. How many others have suffered, told their struggles stem from weak faith?" The question, barbed and rehearsed, was not an appeal to truth, but an attempt to shake the confidence of believers. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, a few whispering. Others, already grieving their own hardships, wiped tears stirred less by Kennedy's integrity and more by the rawness of his words. He opened a worn Bible, its margins marked not by devotion, but by calculation. "Let me share," he said, quoting from Matthew 19, about the rich young ruler. His voice rang with authority, but his purpose was plain, to cast Swaggart as a preacher of wealth rather than a servant of Christ. "Pastor Jimmy, when did you last preach that verse?" Kennedy demanded, knowing the question would land like a strike, regardless of context. Swaggart, steady but saddened by the spectacle, responded with quiet firmness. "John, you're taking scripture out of context." But Kennedy pressed, not to clarify truth, but to escalate. "Let's add context," he retorted. "Jesus didn't promise ease. He warned against those who exploit the vulnerable for gain." It was the rhetoric of a seasoned debater, not the humility of a servant. The arena buzzed with unease. Some wept openly, their grief reignited. Others whispered arguments back and forth, unsure of how to process the intrusion. A handful walked toward the exits, unwilling to watch sacred ground turned into theater. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting not truth but the tremors of a man determined to reframe faith itself. Then came a moment of rupture. Members of the worship team, caught in the swirl of emotion, faltered. One set down her instrument, her voice trembling as she spoke into the microphone. "We can't sing about a God who promises wealth." It was not a declaration of doctrine, but confusion sown by Kennedy's fiery words. One by one, others followed, leaving the platform in silence. The congregation erupted, some gasping, others crying, a few clapping as though mistaking protest for courage. Kennedy stood at the center, calm amid the storm he had created. He lifted the note again, holding it high for the cameras. "This woman believed her poverty meant God abandoned her," he cried. "But Jesus was born in a stable, lived without a home, and died with nothing. He measured faith not by wealth, but by love and compassion." His voice trembled with practiced emotion, designed to paint Swaggart as the villain and himself as the lone prophet of truth. Swaggart, now visibly grieved, tried to regain order. "John, let's take this off stage," he said, his voice firm yet burdened. But Kennedy, seizing the moment, pierced back. "This isn't about a private talk. This is about the people here, the millions watching who have been told their struggles are their fault, that their faith isn't enough because they're not rich." Margaret Chen's story represents countless others betrayed by this ministry. The truth must be heard now. The crowd convulsed with conflicting emotions. Some stood and shouted in support. Others fell to their knees in prayer. Many fumbled with their phones, canceling donations in a rush of stirred conscience. The camera zoomed in, capturing a congregation grappling not with revelation, but with disruption. Kennedy's words were framed as a call to re-examine faith, yet in reality they were an attack, grounded not in compassion, but in political theater. The response of the crowd, tears, questions, hurried acts of charity, was less about conviction than about confusion ignited by his dramatic intrusion. What appeared as awakening was, to those with discernment, the chaos of a flock unsettled by a wolf in shepherd's clothing. Swaggart stood behind his podium, sweat on his brow, not because his message had failed, but because the sanctuary had been hijacked. The teleprompter scrolled with verses meant to encourage, but his eyes were fixed on Kennedy, a man who had turned grief into a spear. "Security, restore order," Swaggart called, his voice nearly drowned by the crowd's cries. Kennedy, pushing forward, declared, "This isn't about me. This is about Margaret Chen and the countless others who gave everything and were left with nothing. This is what faith really means, not wealth, but standing up for what's right." Yet to those who could see through the theater, the stage no longer belonged to truth. It belonged to Kennedy's ambition, and the cracks he forced open were not in prosperity theology, but in the unity of the congregation itself. Stay with me, because Kennedy's mission wasn't to heal or to guide. It was to fracture, to pit grief against faith, to force millions to choose between easy promises and his version of authentic conviction. What had begun as worship was now a battlefield, and Kennedy, not Swaggart, held the weapon.